June 4th, 1942, 9:55, Eastern Island, Midway Atoll. A black-smoked airplane staggers over the reef, gear down but crooked, trailing shreds of fabric like kelp. Ensign Albert Burt Ernest can barely see over the oil-spattered nose of his brand-new Grumman TBF Avenger. Harry Ferrier, just 18, is slumped below in the radio compartment, helmet cracked, blood in his eyes, still conscious enough to pass one last belt of 50 caliber rounds up to the turret that no longer answers. The turret gunner, J. Manning, does not move. The airplane drops the last 50 feet in one ugly heave, slams the coral strip, skids, turns sideways, and stops riddled by more than 70 bullet holes and missing nearly everything that makes airplanes fly, except stubbornness. A Marine ordnanceman runs a hand along the punctures and asks the question that will echo through the day: how did this thing survive? The number everyone else is counting is worse. 6 Avengers launched at dawn from Midway. 5 did not come back. An 83% loss in minutes. And yet, as smoke columns far to the northwest fatten and bloom, a different statistic ascends: 4 carriers crippled within a single hour. The open loop begins here. If the Avengers hardly scratched the Japanese, why did their arrival land like a shockwave in the most experienced carrier strike force on Earth? By 10:20 a.m., the sky southwest of Midway is a stacked chaos of altitudes and intentions. High above, SBDs fall like thrown knives. Far below, the water is laced with wakes from torpedoes that won't run true. In the seam between, the new shape, hunched, armored, heavy-jawed, has made its first statement. Not with hits, with defiance, with a promise. This will multiply. What came in low and left in pieces did not change the battle by damage. It changed the battle by forcing a choice. The island is a dot in an ocean the size of civilization. On a schoolroom map, your finger covers it. In reality, it is 2 low shallows, Sand Island and Eastern Island, encircled by reef, crowned by 2 runways, bunkers of crushed coral, drums of aviation gas, and men who were awake all night. The Japanese call their armada the First Air Fleet, Kido Butai, the spear that cut Pearl Harbor. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hairyu, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and a stalking net of pickets. The plan is arithmetic. Destroy the island's air power at dawn, bait the desperate U.S. fleet, and kill it by noon. On Eastern Island, the plan is patience. Before sunrise, Midway's commander has launched everything with wings. B-17s in loose boxes toward a grid square of ocean. B-26 Marauders modified to carry torpedoes under their bellies, an awkward match of bomber and sea weapon. PBYs sent at night, skimming the horizon to find and stab, and 6 airplanes pulled from crates so new, the varnish smells like a hardware store. The Grumman TBF called Avenger now, a name chosen after December 7th. A name that tells you the country intends to build not just an aircraft, but an answer. The airplane is not graceful. It is big for a single engine, almost 17,000 pounds when heavy, with a barrel of an engine, Wright R 2600 Cyclone 14 cylinders, 1,700 horsepower on paper, a sound like tearing canvas punched through a foghorn. It carries a torpedo in a bomb bay rather than slung under like a pendulum. The crew pilot, turret gunner, radio man sit in compartments separated by metal and frustration. Armor slabs. Self-sealing tanks. A dorsal turret with a 50 caliber Browning, a belly stinger, and something you can't measure with a ruler. Grumman's habit of overbuilding until the factory floor joke becomes a brand, the Grumman Ironworks. You don't so much fly it as shoulder it. That is by design. At dawn, the men who will shoulder it are strangers to both the airplane and the place. The 6 Avengers at Midway are a detachment split off from Torpedo Squadron 8VT-8, which has been learning the TBF in Hawaii, while their parent carrier, Hornet, still operates the older TBD Devastator. Lieutenant Langdon K. Fieberling 27 leads the detachment. He and 5 other pilots have never flown this machine into combat. Their radiomen and gunners are a cross-section of the new Navy. Kids who learned code by tapping sticks on mess tables, mechanics who turned wrenches on tractors last spring, men who can strip a Browning blindfolded but have never seen a Zero up close. The island briefing is short. Enemy carriers to the northwest, spotted by PBYs at dawn. Range and bearing scribbled in grease pencil on a map tacked to a wall of plywood. Altitude to approach. Low. Release speed for torpedo. Painfully slow. Expected opposition. Described with the calm words of men who intend to send you anyway. The Mark 13 torpedo under each Avenger's belly weighs over a ton and carries a 600-pound warhead. It is also a temperamental thing. Drop too fast, it dives like a stone and never recovers. Drop too high, it breaks its back. Set shallow, it may porpoise. Set deep, it may pass under a hull that presents you a perfect profile steel arrogance at 40 feet. The odds, in cold numbers, are bad. In pride, unthinkable. The Japanese do not know these 6 airplanes exist. On December 7th, they saw stubby biplanes and obsolete torpedo bombers in Hawaiian museum colors, and they destroyed them by the dozen. In the months since, their intelligence has noted new types, but not this one. Their fighter cover plan is built around a truth that has served them well. Unarmored, slow attackers die in neat rows. The shock does not come from what the Avenger does to them. It begins with what they do to it and what it refuses to do, namely, stop. By 6 o'clock, a PBY calls the cardinal numbers that make planners stand up in operations shacks. Many ships. By 6:30, the island's bombers are wings level into a headwind that smells like salt and cordite. The Avengers follow. Fieberling leads the 6 into a world of light that seems harmless until you fly into it. The surface of the Pacific is a map and a mirror, reflecting sun into your eyes and hiding small, fast shapes until they are on your canopy. Ferrier, in Ernest's aircraft, watches the water close, the wake throw itself backward. The engine vibration blur screws on the radio panel. He is supposed to monitor frequencies, tune in homing beacons, and pass ammunition up to the turret. He feels the airplane become a boat. "We're going down," someone had joked on the line during warm-up. In more ways than one. Gallows humor is a shock absorber. It does not change the road. The torpedo approach profile is the old catechism. Fly low, fly straight, line up on the beam, present the enemy a problem. The problem, however, is symmetrical. You present the enemy an easy shot. As the 6 Avengers get their first look at carriers wide as factories, their decks mottled with spotted aircraft, a cloud of dots lifts off the nearer ships and grows teeth. Zeros. What happens in the next 10 minutes is a physics lesson scribbled by tracers. The Zeros are faster, lighter, more agile, and flown by pilots who have not yet tasted defeat. The Avengers are heavy, armored, bleached by low-angle salt glare, and flown by men holding speed steady at the suicidal numbers required to keep a torpedo intact. The air between them is a threshing floor. In Ernest's cockpit, the first pass from a Zero rips the canopy glass to sleet. Ferrier hears the big Browning in the turret answer, sees the spent links rattle into the doorway, and reaches up for another box of ammunition. A round cuts through his helmet and snaps his head back. He slumps to the floor out, he thinks, for a few seconds or a minute. He comes to with the smell of gasoline and hot metal in his throat, and the sound of his pilot talking to nobody. Hold on. 2 words, 10 meanings. The Avenger feels heavy over the wave tops. On the left, another TBF cartwheels into a sheet of white. On the right, one pulls up too early, trying to clear the cone of tracers, and is pinned and killed against the sky. Fieberling's airplane call sign, buried under noise, presses forward. There is no way to thread this without being measured in mils by men who have trained for exactly this. The Avenger's dorsal turret is a small, angry thing, and Japanese pilots remark in real time that this new type spits back harder than the slow Devastator. But a turret cannot relocate the horizon. It can only curse it. From the Japanese flagship, the attack looks like an annoyance, until it isn't. The flight deck crews on Akagi shout and point at the gray shapes clawing across the whitecaps. Torpedo doors open. The bridge above, where Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo watches through binoculars, feels the first instant of offense taken personally. These Americans are impertinent enough to keep coming, to press through a cap that has, for 6 months, erased such threats like chalk from slate. Zeros dive into the pattern again and again, each passageometry problem solved with guns. Yet the gray shapes do not break off. It is like hammering a green oak. Splinters fly. The beam flexes. The beam is still there. The B-26 seconds from Midway arrive almost on top of the Avengers, flying faster and higher because their torpedo carriage demands it. One B-26 will knife the length of a carrier's deck, so close the men on the bridge duck instinctively, the airplane clawing past the island structure with inches to spare. Another will go into the water in a smear. A third will shear away trailing smoke like a red scarf. The overall effect on Japanese brains, if you could plot it, is subtle at first, then cumulative. Not one hit, but time, minutes, stolen. Altitudes high and low confused. Fighter direction strained by simultaneous threats from opposite quadrants. And below, the one new thing they did not expect. Taking it, and still there, spitting back. Ferrier wakes up again when the airplane shudders, in a way he has never felt. Ernest has released the torpedo. He cannot see whether the drop is good. He cannot know that the Mark 13 might dive and sulk. He cannot know that today, almost no American torpedo will do what it says on the tin. He knows the airplane is lighter and a little less doomed. He shoves cords, radios, shells, anything, bracing himself against a floor slick with oil. He calls out headings even as the compass spins from shock. The turret is silent now. Manning will not answer. Ernest throws the Avenger into an ocean-hugging jink and points for the white line on the horizon that means home. The other 5 do not make it. Fieberling gone. 3 more gone. One crashes close enough for a Japanese destroyer to rake the sea with fire at the shadows in life vests. One attempts a climbing turn and dies in a tumble that would be graceful if you did not know the names inside. 6 launched. 1 returns. And yet the enemy does not feel triumph in the moment after the last splash. They feel relief, then nerves. This was new. Zoom out. The U.S. Navy's torpedo arm up to this morning looks like a relic of a pre-war imagination. Canvas, covered devastators on carriers, slow, steady, heroic in the way statues are heroic and as vulnerable. Pilots know it. They fly into flak knowing that at best they will disrupt. At worst, they will die and achieve nothing but a change in the color of the sea. The Grumman TBF is not a magic wand. It is a change in arithmetic. Speed, not much improved, but survivability multiplied. A turret that bites. A bomb bay that closes around the weapon like a set of knuckles. Armor that makes the difference between an exit wound and a dent. Self-sealing tanks that turn a fountain of gasoline into a seep. You do not need all 6 to get home. You only need one to tell the story. And the story that matters is not the one told to wives by telegram. It is the one told by the afternoon sky. For 3 hours on June 4th, Japanese fighters are pulled down again and again to sea level by attacks they cannot ignore. B-26s from Midway, Avengers from Midway. Later, devastators from Hornet, Enterprise, Yorktown, doomed men flying straight lines for long seconds, while the enemy's CAP hunts them like jackals. Each wave fails in its own way. Each wave forces a decision. Stay low to cut these plodding trucks to pieces, or climb to meet a different kind of threat dive bombers stepping down out of the high sun like layered knives. Their doctrine says, control the low first. Their confidence says the high can wait. Their timing today is 1 generation late. What the Avengers did, uniquely, was make the low fight expensive. Not by the scorecard of kills 0 pilots will claim many, and most are true, but by the cost in time, in fuel, in eyes pointed the wrong way when the horizon darkens with SBDs, and in expectations punctured by a type that should have died faster and did not. The shock is not, we were damaged. It is, we were distracted and we should not have been. Flashback, Bethpage, Long Island, 1940. In a squat building a few miles from potato fields, Leroy Grumman and his engineers are bent over balsa models in a room that smells like glue, coffee, and cigarettes. They are famous for practical genius. Stick a pencil eraser on a model to simulate a tail bumper. Cut and reglue. Try again. The Navy asks for a torpedo bomber that can carry internally, survive a mistake, and be built in numbers beyond the capacity of a single plant. The drawings that emerge are boxes and arcs, thick spars and panels fastened with a generosity that looks like waste until you crash once and live. The airplane that flies in August 1941 looks like a bulldog with wings. After December 7th, the Navy chooses its name, Avenger, a promise, but also a threat, one rooted not in anger, but in throughput. Within a year, the design will be licensed to General Motors, each TBM stamped from a line that once made sedans. Survive first, scale second, revenge as a consequence. Back to Midway morning. The Avenger's turret is famous in memos, before it is famous in mess halls. Japanese pilots engaged over the ocean have trained on targets that either cannot fire behind them or do so with rifle-caliber nips. The dorsal 50 is something else, the difference between a sting and a gouge. Harry Ferrier recalls that when he could lift his head, he could see the black worms of tracer curling up past the canopy and feel the answering jackhammer from above. He was a kid hours before, eager and talkative. He is old now in ways that will never be visible to a camera. The devastators from the carriers will reinforce the shock in blood. VT-8 from Hornet, flying the old type because their new Avengers are still on Midway, will die almost to a man under the same rules of geometry the Avengers faced earlier. VT-6 from Enterprise, VT-3 from Yorktown, same script, same gun pattern, same sea, disruption compounded. Minutes burned. Fighter cover anchored low for what seems like the decisive threat. Across those minutes comes the real storm. At 10:22 in the morning, 3 American dive bomber squadrons achieve the confluence of luck, scouting, and nerve that war historians politely call a window, and veterans call finally. SBD Dauntlesses fall out of a clear lid of sky. The carriers below are either turning into the wind to launch or frozen amid the choreographed chaos of arming and refueling. When bombs complete their geometries, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu are hit. Their decks, loaded with fuel and ordnance, make the sound of demolition charges going off inside a drum. The air above them changes, from aggressive to ragged, from owned to contested, from a rehearsal to an accident in slow motion. This, for our story, is where cause and effect insists on a chain rather than a single link. The Avengers did not put bombs into those decks. They did something harder to plot and easier to miss. They helped subtract time from a precise enemy. They bought minutes with their lives. They changed altitudes with their presence. They planted a thought in fighter leaders' heads, new type, armored, keeps coming, that will, 2 months later off Guadalcanal, become a habit. Do not leave these torpedo men unharassed. They cost you even when they miss. Inside Ernest's Avenger, the instruments are a Greek chorus complaining, oil pressure sagging, temperature spiking, control cables frayed so badly you could cut yourself on them. The hydraulic lines will not, cannot, have any fluid left. And yet, somehow the gear stumbles down. The prop bites air, as if it has had enough of water for one morning. When the airplane stops, the men who run to it see a thing that does not die the way their training films said it would. Ferrier crawls out, his face a map of dried and fresh blood, his eyes bright. "We made it," he says, as if he is surprised. He will say in years to come that he did not feel brave. He felt busy. The island knows by mid-morning who is missing. The chalkboard with crew names becomes a kind of weather report. Letters erased are not replaced. It is not yet known, on Midway, what is happening far to the west, beyond the curve of the world. But you can smell it on the wind that comes over the reef in the early afternoon, a smell like tar and roasted metal. The Marines at the runway point at the column on the horizon and do not cheer. They stare. Then they look back at the Avenger with holes big enough to poke fingers through and begin to understand something even without the map lines. This airplane brings a new rule. By the end of the day, the battle narrative will make heroes of the dive bomber leaders, rightly. But there is a second story, written in losses, that the enemy reads silently. When they list the American types encountered on June 4th, they jot a note next to one silhouette. Dorsal turret, armored, difficult to shoot down, pressed attack despite heavy fire. They will meet it again and again in the next 3 years. In the slot between the Solomons, off Santa Cruz, over the Philippine Sea, it will sink carriers, light cruisers, and transports. It will hunt submarines until submariners give it an obscene nickname and pray to cloud cover. It will drop mines into harbors so quietly that war ends and shipping lanes remember. But on the morning of June 4th, it looked like a failed experiment that would nonetheless not stop. That is the seed of shock. Not fear of what it did, fear of what it meant. The meaning is in steel and gasoline math. To build an Avenger requires thousands of man-hours, tons of aluminum, rubber, copper, a river of crude turned into avgas, a web of suppliers from Cheektowaga to Oakland. To replace 5 lost in a morning requires not a shrug but an industry. The United States has already decided to shovel whole states into this furnace and call it production. Japan, master of the opening moves, cannot match that. They do not feel that yet, standing on a slanting deck, holding on to a rail while black smoke claws at the Sunday. They feel a more immediate thing. We will need more fighters low, more ammunition on hand, more eyes. Shock is a beginning. Strategy is the cure. Resources are the limit. By June 5th, some of the survivors on Midway will gather, exhausted, around the returned Avenger and take pictures that will end up framed on dens and in VFW halls. Ferrier will be in one or two, bandaged, his expression confused by gratitude and grief. Ernest will tell anyone who asks that the airplane saved them as much as any skill he brought to the yoke. An ordnanceman will stand with a cigarette in his mouth next to an empty rack that held 6 torpedoes at dawn and hold up one finger, 1 out of 6. But see what that one tells you. Cut back now that we have the island's view to the carrier's decks in the minutes after the initial low-level attacks end. The deck crews look up at the lattice of contrails high above, and the smudges of flak blooms spreading like bruises. They return to the choreographies of arming and refueling, caught between the tactical urgency to launch and the operational sense that the enemy has found them. They do not know that the dive bombers are coming. But the men directing fighter patrols do know that the low threat is not over. It keeps returning, stubborn as tide. The fighter direction officer makes choices in 10-second increments. He cannot be in 2 altitudes at once. The Avengers pocket those 10 seconds the way a pickpocket removes a wallet, almost invisible until you reach for it. This is how system behavior emerges from a handful of micro-decisions. Pressed by a new weapon that refuses to die on schedule, the defenders bias low. Pressed low, they miss the high. Missing the high, they lose the carriers that coordinate the whole. Once the carriers go, doctrine unspools. Destroyers become lifeboats. Cruisers become shields for wakes that go the wrong direction. The most precise fleet in the world becomes a crowd in the space of 1 hour. By early afternoon, the news hits Midway's ops shack like a wave that takes the breath first, then the words. 3 carriers burning. The man who says it does not raise his voice. The room goes quiet in the way an engine room goes quiet when you throttle back and realize how loud it was. No one celebrates in the way Monday mornings imagine. They mark the board again. They brew coffee. They count airplanes. They send search planes over slicks. They patch holes in an Avenger that looks like a sieve and run numbers in their heads they will only admit at night. How many more can we lose like this and still win? The answer, though they do not know it fully yet, is more than the enemy can afford to knock down. The Avenger at Midway did not carry victory aboard. It carried a new ratio. Losses would still be terrible. Torpedo work would still be the worst job in naval aviation. But survivability multiplied. Effect on enemy behavior multiplied. Production multiplied. What shocked Japan that morning was less the teeth marks none of the early torpedoes bit and more the jaw strength. They would see the teeth soon enough, off Guadalcanal, when Avengers, now familiar with their own weight and weapons that run true, would put fish into steel at twilight ranges and tie whole convoys into knots. The first hint was here. The silhouette that should have died faster and didn't. The island day stretches toward an orange edge. The Avenger, with a hunched back and patched skin, sits under a tarp while mechanics argue about whether a particular cable can be spliced. Ferrier sits on an ammo crate and watches the reef, while a corpsman changes his dressing with fingers that smell like iodine. "How many?" he asks softly, not about carriers. "From our 6, the corpsman answers. The number lands between them like a tool dropped on concrete. Then they say nothing for a while. By the time darkness rolls in, the men on both sides write in logbooks words that seem too small for what has happened. Enemy attack repulsed. Attack pressed. Heavy opposition. They will sleep on canvas cots, on wardroom benches, on steel decks hot even after sunset, in cockpits tilted askew over coral, and dream the morning again. The new shape is in those dreams. On one side, it is an irritation that would not stop. On the other, a lifeboat with wings. The why, divided by how question that hung in the setup, why did a handful of new bombers matter if they did not score, has a partial answer now. They mattered because war at sea is a timing problem before it is a killing contest. They took time. They changed where eyes looked. They shifted risk up and down the column of air, making an opening for something else to be lethal. They also carried a telegram from American factories that read, "There will be more of us tomorrow." In the Midway narratives, the cameo of the Avenger is often a paragraph. In the lives of the men who flew that morning, it is the whole book. The turret gunner, who did not come back, is a sentence in that book that ends too soon. The airplane that did come back is the hardback spine that holds it together. Grumman Ironworks, the sailors say later, half mocking, half blessings. They never mean the factory. They mean the feeling inside the cockpit when the wing you thought was gone is still attached. This is development, not denouement. The climax is still ahead. The moment the enemy reads their own after-action notes and realizes the silhouette that bothered them at Midway has metastasized into a pattern they cannot counter with tactics alone. Systems now, not just pilots. Trains of ore, rivers of gasoline, lines of riveters in Buffalo. Before we climb there, hold one more image. Ernest, after the landing, walks around his airplane and touches the holes along the fuselage one by one. He puts his hand flat against the metal where, he is told later, the cable that moves the tail is half chewed. He stands by the turret and looks in, sees a glove left on the seat, sees that it still holds a curl as if a hand were inside it. He does not say anything. He does not have to. The airplane says it for him. You asked too much of me. I gave almost all. You will ask more tomorrow. I will be there. By the numbers, the Avenger at Midway failed. By the arc of the morning, it succeeded at something numbers do not always catch. Making the enemy change, then making the enemy pay for that change minutes later when the sky above them split and fell. What happened next made the pattern obvious. Launch time is 6:10. The 6 Avengers trundle to the eastern island runway, their tires tapping seams in the coral, the torpedoes slung ovals under bellies that look too low already. On the line, an ordnanceman named Flowers gives each fuselage a slap like a coach. Fieberling goes first checks, thumbs up, throttle forward, tail rising with the humbling grace of a big thing gathering itself. Ernest rolls, the cyclone rattling your teeth even if you are 100 yards away. The coral dust hangs. Then they are angles against the early blue. Their approach vector, by the book laid down years ago, will require them to skirt below the enemy's radar horizon until the last minutes, then break toward the carriers on reciprocal courses. The water at 10 feet looks friendly and fatal at once. A small mistake here is not a mistake, just an end. The radiomen keep hands on sets tuned to Midway's beacon. The turret gunners keep hands on grips slick with oil. The pilots keep hands light because heavy hands in heavy airplanes make problems. At 7:10, they glimpse destroyers' first thin, purposeful shape scissoring wakes like chalk strokes. Minutes later, the carriers resolve from haze. They are majestic in the way a factory is majestic ordered, huge, machine-like, and they are vulnerable in exactly the way a factory is. When you happen to be in the one place the designers did not intend to test, the place around 100 feet off the water and 1,000 yards out from the beam is such a place. Unfortunately, it is also a killing zone from the defender's point of view. Zeros drop in cascades. The first passes rip fabric and skin. The Avenger's armor takes the bite from fragments, but the clear parts explode in cubes. The dorsal turret clatters back. On him, a gunner shouts. The muzzle flash is a strobe that lights the cockpit below in pulses. The noise is not just loud, it is close, intimate, as if the fight is taking place inside the aluminum walls rather than outside. Ernest feels the sticks go soft, then heavy, then alive again. He holds course, because if you flinch, you expose more body. Courage is sometimes nothing more than an inability to imagine a better option. Ferrier leans up, pushes a new can of ammunition into the feed, feels something hot kiss his scalp and then a coldness that he will remember better than the hot. He comes back with his helmet askew and wipes blood from the gauge glass to read numbers that reassure him that numbers still exist. The pilot's voice is steady, the gun stops, the world tilts. Drop! The throaty clunk of the torpedo leaving is like a held breath exhaled. The torpedo runs its own war now. a cylinder with rules it rarely follows. Ernest must make a perfect shallow turn without presenting a fat silhouette to the gunners. He must climb enough to get away, not enough to invite a belly full of bullets. At this point, the airplane stops being numbers and becomes superstition. You duck under bursts the way a boxer slips a hook. The Avenger, for all its size, moves like a barge in a crosswind. But it moves. Behind them, other drops. One Avenger releases too high. The splash is wrong. Another never releases. The airplane explodes mid-turn. The survivors, if that word can be used for this part of a sentence, skid out toward a horizon that seems to recede out of spite. The Zeros take their trophies and break off to meet a new thread of targets B-26 seconds, coming at an angle the Avengers cannot match. The B-26 run is a mix of audacity and misfit engineering. The Marauder is fast, but not meant for this. Torpedoes and high speed have terms they must negotiate. One Marauder's pilot will fly the length of a carrier's deck because his options have narrowed to 0 and forward. The Japanese bridge officers will never forget the shadow that submerged their view with inches to spare. This is the first layer of the morning's montage. Layer 2. At 8:20, island-based Marine SBDs and SB-2, us that fought the first wave at dawn, limp home. Their reports of ships and fighters thicken the plot but cannot change it. Layer 3. By 9:20, after the carrier strikes from the U.S. fleet begin to arrive piecemeal, the low sky becomes a place of permanent hazard for the Japanese. Every 10 minutes, someone appears where no one should want to be, flying straight at the side of a ship with the stamina of delusion. This is the kind of courage that, by early afternoon, forces the enemy into basic arithmetic they did not think they would have to do. How many more sorties can we keep down low? How many gallons of fuel do we burn off the cap for each minute we spend at sea level, chasing ghosts that carry real weapons? The numbers told a different story than pride. By 10 o'clock, Japanese fighter cover is divided into altitude bands like fences, but fences only work if you have posts. Posts today are fatigue, miscommunication, the need to land and refuel, the need to keep the launch cycle clean. A low attacker with armor and a turret that refuses to die plugs into those gaps. Even if shot down, he burns minutes, and the minutes are fatal somewhere else. When the dive bombers arrive at 10:22, all the low killing in the world cannot refund the time. The link between those minutes and the explosions that follow is not obvious when you are tracking a single tracer. It is obvious when you stand back at dusk and look at the day as a time lapse. Here, the human threads tighten. The Avengers pilots at Midway were not legends that morning. They were men whose names will later be carved in places you have to visit on purpose. Fieberling, who led them, does not get a gravestone on land. Farrier will live to speak in school gyms about what it felt like to be 18 and have his head snapped back by something faster than thought, then to wake to a world where the gauges still worked. Ernest will log the landing that should not have been possible and carry around for the rest of his life the memory of mechanics' hands gently pressing on torn skin of his airplane as if testing a wound on a living creature. These images do not win battles. They explain what battles are made of. The airplane, likewise, is not a single thing. The Avenger's type history is a lattice of decisions made before dawn. Internal carriage of torpedo meant less drag on the run and fewer chances for the weapon to depart in the wrong direction. The big engine meant a heavy nose, which meant stability in chop and reluctance in roll. The armor meant survival in glancing blows, and the self-sealing tanks turned spectacular fireballs into slow leaks. All of that, in 5 out of 6 cases this morning, still wasn't enough. But honor does not write doctrine. Data does. One survivor that should have died 10 minutes into the run tells planners more than 6 conspicuous deaths. It says, "Scale me, put me on every deck, fix my weapon, train my crews, then see." On the Japanese side, the first pencil notes in the margin are simple, new U.S. torpedo bomber type. Turret, armament heavy, crewmen determined. Then, as the day's patterns click into place, frequent attacks at low altitude compelled cap to remain low, a sentence that in bureaucratic Japanese translates to, "Our eyes were not where the next fatal thing came from." That is shock repurposed into lesson. The enemy did not adapt instantly, not because they were slow or arrogant, but because their machine had too many moving parts today and 2/3 of them were on fire. We return finally to the runway where everything began. The Avenger sits like a testimony. The holes along its length are not random but clustered where attackers slid in and fired where flesh and fuel should have been. The leading edges look gnawed. The canopy is cobwebbed. The turret is a crater of silence where a voice used to live. Men touch it with the respect men feel for practical miracles. They do not kneel. They do not pray aloud. They catalogue. They estimate. They brief. War's poetry is written in numbers first, and then, on nights like this, in the way a pilot stares at the wing of a machine that got him home. By midnight, the island is too tired to feel fear properly. They will feel it tomorrow. The radio room crackles with words that seem beyond luck and beyond skill, 3 carriers burning, then later a 4th fought to the end by its own men and finally given to the sea. The Avengers at Midway cannot claim the kills. They can claim a part of the cause. That is enough for the thesis that will emerge after the fires die. Survivability that forces choice is a weapon. For the men who flew them, that thesis is academic. They will measure success in the faces that return to the line the next morning, and in the handprints mechanics leave on torn aluminum like signatures. The day after, a young Marine will stand next to the battered Avenger and trace a hole with a pencil, then circle it, then write a number. He is doing inventory. He is also, without knowing it, writing a prophecy. Each circle is an indication of what this airplane can endure today. Multiply the circles by months and theaters and production runs. Add torpedoes that run true, and you get a pressure that pushes back against an empire's plans. Shock at first. Then re-evaluation. Then, as the silhouette appears again over the bows of ships from the Aleutians to the Bismarck Sea, acceptance. Midway is not about one airplane, but one airplane can carry a message too loud to ignore. The Avenger spoke in metal, in minutes, stolen, in the stubborn grammar of the straight-line torpedo run under fire. The enemy understood it by noon. The rest of the world would understand it by war's end, when that silhouette would patrol coasts no longer under threat, hunting submarines with a mechanical patience that suggested a different future. An ocean not of heroes and deaths, but of flights and returns. We will leave the island now for a moment and step into the enemy's ready room, where chalk dust hangs, and a pilot puts his hand to the board to steady himself while writing the simple words of a completed sortie. He writes them, but he is thinking of the one that should have died faster and didn't. At 10:22 in the morning, the sky finally speaks in a different register. It does not murmur. It drops knives. SBDs step down through sun glare, stitching angles that end in fire. Flight decks become griddles. Fuel lines become fuses. Explosions punch through wood and steel and carry names Akagi, Kaga, Soryu into a future where they are photographs. Down low, Zeros still circle the straight-line killers. They are guarding the wrong door. On Akagi's bridge, the language of certainty runs out. Fighters are in the low box. Torpedoes were the visible threat. The invisible one arrives from altitude with almost mathematical elegance. A choice made 10 minutes ago becomes a sentence you cannot rewrite. The open loop closes. The new torpedo bomber did not sink the carriers. It made them sinkable. Short lines, hard edges, a reframing. They thought the danger was massed courage. The danger was misallocated minutes. They thought armor was an annoyance. Armor was a time machine. They thought a turret was an afterthought. A turret was a magnet. The single line that ties it all together. They didn't win Midway with hits. They won it by stealing time. By the afternoon of June 4th, the pattern is plain even to men too exhausted to name it. Pressed low by successive torpedo attacks, first Midway's, then the carrier Devastator's Japanese fighter direction lives at sea level. Above, Dauntlesses do geometry. Below, Avengers change the denominator of risk. That denominator, minutes, fuel, eyes, breaks the day. From this point, the story widens. Midway becomes prologue. The silhouette that shocked at dawn turns into a system by fall. August 24th, 1942, off the Eastern Solomons. Avengers fly cover over an American fleet, learning to fight with fewer illusions. The torpedo remains temperamental. Drops must still be gentle. low, almost humiliatingly slow. But the airplanes do not die at the old rate. Armor buys exit paths. Turrets complicate trailing shots. When bombs find carriers on that afternoon, the low sky is again full of men who forced the choice. October 26th, 1942. Santa Cruz. Enterprise staggers through smoke and shrapnel. Avengers lift in 2s and 3s from decks that pitch like bad ideas. They don't rewrite the battle, they stabilize it. Their presence in the low band makes the enemy spend pilots where bombs are not falling. It is not glamorous, and it is decisive. By 1943, the unseen part of the weapon is finally fixed. The Mark 13 receives a wooden drag ring and tail shrouds simple carpentry that changes outcomes. The drop envelope expands from a finicky 50 feet and 110 knots to the kind of numbers pilots can actually fly in combat hundreds of feet, well over 200 knots. The torpedo stops sulking and starts running hot, straight, and normal. The airplane that once carried a promise now carries a solution. Numbers illustrate what doctrine feels like. More than 9,800 Avengers roll out by war's end, Grumman's factory, plus General Motors plants, turning sedans into TBMs at an industrial tempo. One type, 2 letters, thousands of crews. Over the Solomons, across the Marshalls, into the Marianas, the silhouette repeats like a drumbeat. The enemy adapts tactically more cap. Tighter discipline but cannot adapt industrially. The United States throws towns at the problem and calls it production. There is a human gradient inside those numbers. In a ready room on Guadalcanal, a pilot checks the torpedo setting lever 3 times with the superstition of someone who has already lost 2 wingmen to duds. In a hangar on Espiritu Santo, an ordnance man weighs a wooden nose ring in his hands and grins at its homeliness. If it works, no one will care that it looks like a barrel hoop. On a flight deck near Tarawa, a crew chief slaps a skin panel and says to his pilot, "Heavy is a kind of safe. Practical poetry. Spoken in oil and finger grease. The Avengers do not just carry fish. They learn new trades. Anti-submarine warfare, once a patient cruelty of destroyers, becomes airborne. Sonobuoys talk in pings, primitive but effective, acoustic torpedoes. Listen." A mid-Atlantic night in June 1944, an escort carrier group hunts a Japanese submarine far from any island war. Avengers from USS Bogue find 52 inches the dark water and sink it with a weapon that pretends to be a mine and turns out to be a homing predator. The war has moved into a different century in the space of 2 years, and the TBF is still in the frame. The arc from Midway to late 1944 is punctuated by set pieces. The Marianas, June 19th to 20th, 1944. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot is mostly a fighter's tale, but afterward Avengers run down fleeing ships and puncture hulls that a day earlier seemed untouchable. Leyte Gulf, October 23rd to 26th. Escort carrier Avengers, flying from tiny decks behind thin screens, warn the world what desperation looks like with a smile. They drop bombs when torpedoes are scarce, depth charges when bombs fail, smoke when neither will do. Heavy cruisers limp because a TBM put a gift under the waterline at the wrong time. A Japanese surface fleet, surprised, turns partly because of destroyers that disobeyed calculus, partly because of airplanes that wore persistence like armor. Then April 7th, 1945. Operation Tengo. Yamato, the last cathedral to battleship faith, drives south with almost no air cover. The kill is a hammer made of many hands. Avengers go for the flanks, torpedoes set shallow, pilots briefed to favor one side. Dive bombers break the decks, torpedoes roll the hull. The biggest battleship ever built dies of systems, not symbols. In the wreck's oil-slicked autopsy is the logic that began at Midway. Control a clock, then the ocean follows. What changed inside the men who flew them is quieter and harder to tabulate. "The airplane got us home," Albert Ernest told those who asked, a sentence that doubles as a doctrine. Harry Ferrier, who woke up inside a cockpit that felt like a coffin, later said the thing he remembered most was not fear, but workload. Too much to do to be scared. That is what survivability buys in practice. Seconds to think, space to act, the possibility of choosing a better mistake. The enemy's memory changes too. Early war debriefs labeled American torpedo craft as slow and fragile. Late 1943 notes deliver a different verdict: armored, close-range persistence, frequent, coordinated, press, home even when intercepted. The silhouette that shocked them at Midway becomes a planning assumption. That is the deepest kind of defeat, when the thing that scared you once becomes the thing you must always expect. The consequences roll forward beyond the surrender ceremony. Post-war, Avengers fly in dark, empty oceans where the enemy is time. They map ice, they herd weather, they patrol coasts. A machine built to survive tracer cones becomes a platform for patience. Pilots sit under canopies that smell like old canvas and hydraulic fluid, and look for nothing, and by finding nothing, declare the ocean safe. The weapon has turned into a guarantee. In the ledgers, the arithmetic is cold and clear. Torpedo performance improves by orders of magnitude. Loss rates, while humanly bitter, fall from the suicidal Decembers of 1941 to 1942 to the survivable summers of 1944 to 1945. For Japan, the numbers invert. Carrier decks shrink to rumors. Fuel stocks bleed out. Replacement pilots arrive with hours instead of seasons. Against that reality, a durable torpedo bomber is not a tactic. It is a verdict. Memory, the last front, sorts what to keep. Museums will showcase dive bombers with dramatic silhouettes and narratives of vertical courage. Rightly so. But in the corner, an Avenger sits with hatches open, a ladder leaning on its side. A placard that underplays its influence. A child will climb the ladder and look into a turret that once made enemy pilots curse out loud. A veteran will pass a hand along rivets and feel something like gratitude. Return to the micro-image that began this. Eastern Island, coral runway. An airplane limps in. The mechanic's palm on the torn aluminum is both diagnosis and blessing. That image doesn't change in the retelling. What changes is what it stands for. Not a fluke, a forecast. The day we opened with returns in an inverted mirror. Morning. A battered Avenger stumbles onto Midway, too shot up to taxi straight, too stubborn to quit. Afternoon. 3 carriers burn because time was stolen low and spent high. Evening. A 4th goes down fighting, and the ocean forgets its shape for a few hours. The universal takeaway won't fit on a plaque, but it fits in a single contrast. Not through perfect weapons, but through imperfect ones that kept showing up. Not through single strikes, but through pressure that forced choices. Not through heroes alone, but through systems that made heroism compound. The button is quiet, the way truths often are. The airplane that failed by the numbers won by the clock.